There are moments in life when you realize someone hasn't just stolen from you. They've convinced themselves they had every right to do it. That's the part that sticks with you. Not the money, not the loss, but the look on their face when they honestly believe your years of hard work belong to them. Looking back now, I can laugh about the pigs. Everybody else certainly does. But back then there wasn't anything funny about it. My name is Walter Bennett, and for over 3 decades I've owned a little apple orchard just outside of town called Cedar Hollow. My father planted the first trees with his own hands, and after he passed, I promised myself I'd never let that land become another housing development or another empty field with a for sale sign sitting out front. Every spring I'd prune every branch myself. Every summer I'd check every row before sunrise, and every fall I'd watch those old heirloom varieties turn into colors you can't even describe unless you've stood beneath them in the morning light. Crimson, gold, deep green, almost black. Every tree had its own personality. I wasn't raising apples because it made me rich. Truth is, farming rarely does. I raised them because that orchard was my family's story written into the soil. Folks around town knew my place. Parents brought their kids every October. School buses stopped by during harvest season. Local bakers bought fruit from me every year because they said supermarket apples didn't taste like anything anymore. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and at my age, honest work was enough. The only unusual thing about my property was what sat on the other side of the old stone fence. A luxury event venue called Briar Ridge Estate. 20 years ago, it had been a quiet country inn. Then investors bought it, expanded it, built gardens, fountains, giant reception halls, and suddenly people were spending more money on one wedding than I had spent buying my first tractor. Funny thing was, we got along just fine for years. Their guests loved taking pictures near my orchard from a respectful distance, and every now and then I'd wave at a bride walking across the lawn while I was loading bushels onto my old pickup. It never bothered me. Happy people don't usually make trouble. Then everything changed when they hired a new events director named Travis Holloway. You ever meet someone who smiles with every word, but somehow makes you feel like you've just been insulted? That was Travis. He was one of those polished city guys who could sell snow to people living in Alaska. Every sentence out of his mouth included words like authentic, handcrafted, local experience, farm fresh, like he'd memorized every marketing phrase in existence without ever digging dirt out from under his fingernails. The first time we met, he drove into my orchard in a spotless black SUV that looked like it had never touched gravel before. He stepped out wearing loafers that probably cost more than my work boots, looked around like he was inspecting a museum exhibit, and said, "Walter, you've got exactly what our clients are looking for." I figured maybe this was finally going to be a decent business opportunity. Weddings used a lot of apples. Pies, cider, centerpieces, desserts. Maybe we'd both come out ahead. We walked through the rows together, and I explained how every variety ripened at different times. He nodded politely, barely listening, then asked how much fruit I could supply during wedding season. I told him enough to keep several events stocked every weekend if we planned ahead. He smiled wider than ever and finally asked about pricing. When I quoted him my wholesale rate, already lower than what tourists paid at my roadside stand, he chuckled like I'd told a joke. "Walter," he said, resting one hand on a tree my father planted before I was born, "our budget is closer to $2 a bushel." I honestly thought I'd misheard him. $2? I asked. "You mean $2 less?" He shook his head. "No, $2 total. Think about the exposure. Hundreds of wealthy guests tasting your apples every weekend. That's marketing money can't buy." I laughed before I could stop myself. "Son," I said, "exposure doesn't pay property taxes." His smile faded just enough for me to notice. "You'll reconsider," he replied. "If not, we'll find another source." I shrugged. "That's your right." He climbed back into his SUV without another word, and I figured that would be the end of it. For a couple of weeks, nothing happened. Harvest season rolled closer, the trees filled out beautifully, and life settled back into its normal rhythm. Then one morning I noticed several Honeycrisp apples missing near the fence line. Deer, I thought. Happens every year. A few days later, another tree looked lighter than it should have. Squirrels, maybe. By the end of that week, entire branches had been stripped clean, and somehow only the best fruit was disappearing. Animals don't pick favorites like that. People do. Standing there in the quiet before sunrise with an empty ladder leaning against one of my oldest trees, I had a feeling in my gut that something much bigger had just begun. I wish I could tell you I was the kind of man who immediately called the sheriff, hired a lawyer, and had the whole thing sorted out within a week. But that isn't how life works when you own a farm. You spend so much of your time giving people the benefit of the doubt that it almost becomes a habit. For another few days, I convinced myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe teenagers were climbing the fence after dark. Maybe someone had wandered in by accident during one of the weddings. Maybe I was just getting old and imagining the losses were worse than they really were. Then my neighbor Earl stopped by one afternoon to borrow my post-hole digger. Earl had been ranching cattle longer than I'd been growing apples, and he had eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He stood beside one of the northern spy trees, folded his arms, and quietly asked, "Walter, why are there fresh boot prints under every tree?" I looked down. He was right. Not random footprints either. The same tread pattern. Heavy work boots. Multiple people. Walking organized rows like they knew exactly where they were going. Earl didn't say another word. He simply looked toward Briar Ridge Estate, then back at me, and that was enough. That evening I drove into town and bought 4 motion-activated trail cameras, the kind hunters use during deer season. I mounted one near the stone fence, another overlooking the oldest section of the orchard, a third near the equipment shed, and the last one facing the narrow opening where anyone crossing from the estate would naturally enter. Then I waited. 3 nights later, just after 1 in the morning, my phone buzzed with the first alert. I didn't even breathe while the video loaded. 4 figures wearing dark jackets climbed over the fence carrying wicker baskets. A 5th man followed behind them with a small utility cart. When he stepped beneath the moonlight, I recognized him instantly. Travis Holloway. He wasn't supervising from a distance. He was leading them. They moved through my orchard with the confidence of people who had done it many times before. They ignored the lower quality fruit completely and picked only the biggest Honeycrisp, the prettiest wine saps, and every perfect Arkansas black they could reach. I watched one employee carefully twist each apple from the branch exactly the way I had taught seasonal workers years ago. That part somehow hurt more than the theft itself. They weren't grabbing random fruit. They knew exactly what they were taking. 45 minutes later, they wheeled 6 overflowing baskets back across the property line toward the estate kitchens. I replayed the footage 4 times before sunrise, partly because I couldn't believe what I was seeing and partly because I wanted to make absolutely certain there could be no mistake. The next morning, I drove straight to Briar Ridge. Travis was standing near the ballroom directing florists while workers unloaded thousands of dollars worth of decorations. He smiled when he saw me. "Walter," he called out. "Beautiful morning." "Not for you," I answered. I opened my laptop on the hood of my truck and hit play. His smile disappeared for exactly 2 seconds. Then, unbelievably, it came back. "You put cameras up?" he asked. "On my own property?" "Yeah. Funny how that works." He watched another 30 seconds of video before shrugging his shoulders like we were discussing the weather. "Honestly," he said, "this doesn't have to become a big issue." I stared at him, waiting for the apology that never came. Instead, he folded his hands together and spoke in the calm, polished voice he probably used with wedding clients. "Think about this from a business perspective. People attending these events are exactly your target customers. Every tart, every centerpiece, every cider display is free advertising for your orchard." I couldn't help laughing, though there wasn't an ounce of humor in it. "Advertising?" I asked. "You climbed my fence in the middle of the night. Let's not get hung up on technicalities." "Technicalities? We're neighbors, Walter. We support each other. You have more apples than you can possibly sell. We use a small percentage to create memorable guest experiences. Everyone benefits." I leaned closer until we were only a couple of feet apart. "Did you seriously just call stealing a partnership?" His expression hardened for the first time. Words like stealing create unnecessary conflict. Because that's exactly what it is. He sighed dramatically, glanced around to make sure no clients were listening, then lowered his voice. "Look, I'll still offer $2 a bushel going forward." I almost thought he was joking. "Going forward?" I said. "You already owe me thousands. You can't prove the value of every apple." I turned the laptop back toward him. "I can prove every single person who crossed my fence." He gave the screen one last look before smiling again. Only this time, there wasn't any friendliness left behind it. "Then I suppose you'll want to speak with our attorney." That sentence stayed with me all the way home. Not because it scared me, but because it told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't embarrassed. He genuinely believed his position protected him from consequences. I contacted the county sheriff anyway. Deputy Lisa Morgan came out the following afternoon. She walked the fence line, examined the footage, photographed damaged branches, and nodded slowly. "This is criminal trespassing," she admitted. "Problem is, they'll probably argue there was confusion over the property line." I pointed toward the century-old stone markers that had divided our land since before either of us had been born. "Confusion?" I asked. "Those stones have been there 100 years. She sighed. "I know, but cases like this take time. Time. That's the one thing farmers never seem to have enough of during harvest season." While paperwork moved from one office to another, my orchard kept losing fruit. Every few nights another alert came through. Sometimes 3 workers, sometimes 6. Once they even drove a small electric cart directly between my rows with portable floodlights, harvesting apples as casually as if they owned the place. The losses became impossible to ignore. Families who had reserved fruit weeks in advance had to settle for different varieties because their favorites were gone. A bakery in the next county canceled half its order after I couldn't meet the promised quantity. One elderly couple who had visited every autumn for nearly 20 years left disappointed because there weren't enough Honeycrisp apples left for them to take home to their grandchildren. That conversation hit me harder than losing the money. After they drove away, I stood alone beside the empty bins wondering how many more seasons I had left to do this. My wife, Margaret, used to tell me that orchards remember how people treat them. She'd been gone nearly 8 years by then, but some mornings I still caught myself expecting to hear her humming while she packed cider donuts for customers. Standing there in that silence, I could almost hear her voice telling me not to let bitterness ruin the land we'd spent our lives caring for. I wanted to listen. I really did. So I tried one last time. I requested a formal meeting with Briar Ridge's ownership group. 3 board members sat around a polished conference table while Travis confidently explained that my accusations were exaggerated. Then he presented photographs from their weddings. Giant dessert tables covered with apple tarts, decorative baskets overflowing with fresh fruit, handcrafted cider stations. Every display featured apples I recognized immediately. One Arkansas Black in particular still had the tiny scar near its stem from a hailstorm in June. I'd watched that apple grow for months. "Those are mine," I said quietly. Travis leaned back in his chair. "Can you prove that?" One of the board members shifted uncomfortably but stayed silent. Another asked if perhaps compensation could resolve the misunderstanding. Before I could answer, Travis interrupted. "There's nothing to compensate. Farmers lose produce all the time. Wildlife, weather, spoilage." Then he looked directly at me and delivered the sentence that finally erased every ounce of patience I had left. "Frankly, Mr. Bennett, you should be grateful your orchard contributes to the atmosphere that allows this venue to thrive." Grateful? I drove home with those words echoing in my head. About halfway down my gravel road, I passed the south pasture, where 40 heritage pigs were rooting happily through fresh grass, completely unaware that humans had once again found a way to complicate something that should have been simple. They looked up when my truck rolled by, expecting dinner, and for the first time in weeks, an idea quietly began to take shape. Not an illegal one, not a violent one, just the sort of lesson that only a farmer with very determined livestock could possibly teach. The timing, as fate would have it, was about to become absolutely perfect because the biggest wedding Briar Ridge had ever hosted was only 10 days away, and it belonged to Travis himself. Word travels fast in a small town, especially when someone spends months bragging about an event that's supposed to be the social gathering of the year. By the time Travis's daughter's wedding weekend arrived, everyone within 50 miles had heard about it. 300 guests, a famous chef flown in from Chicago, an 8-tier wedding cake that reportedly cost more than my first pickup truck, ice sculptures, a string quartet, imported flowers, valet parking. Every little detail had been carefully planned to impress people who were already used to being impressed. What caught my attention wasn't any of that. It was the menu. Someone left one of their promotional brochures at the feed store, and right there in elegant gold lettering were the dessert selections: heirloom apple tart, caramel baked apples, orchard cider reduction. They didn't mention my farm by name, of course, but they didn't have to. I knew my fruit when I saw it. Those rare heirloom varieties weren't something you picked up from a wholesale warehouse. They had taken them from my trees, and now they were serving them to guests as if they had earned them. That Saturday afternoon, I went about my chores like I always did. I checked the fences, filled the water troughs, and fed my pigs. If you've never spent time around heritage pigs, you probably imagine loud, dirty animals with no personality. The truth is they're remarkably smart. Mine knew my voice, recognized the sound of my truck, and could smell food from an unbelievable distance. They especially loved anything sweet. Apples, pastries, leftover pie crust. If sugar was involved, nothing could distract them. As the evening settled in, a light breeze started drifting across the pasture. It carried the unmistakable smell of roasted meat, fresh bread, buttercream frosting, and apples. My pigs lifted their heads almost in unison. A few snorted. One particularly stubborn sow named Daisy walked toward the fence and stood there staring across the field. I couldn't help smiling. Yeah, I quietly muttered. I smell it too. My pasture backed up to an older hedgerow that separated my land from a decorative garden on the edge of Briar Ridge. The fence surrounding my own livestock pasture was entirely on my property. I unlatched one interior gate that simply allowed the pigs access to a larger enclosed grazing section bordering the hedge. I hadn't chased them toward the venue. I hadn't damaged anyone's property. I simply opened the section of pasture they normally weren't using. Nature handled the rest. The breeze kept carrying the scent of fresh food across the field, and before long 40 determined pigs began exploring every inch of that fence line. What happened next became local legend. Somehow, one loose landscaping panel along the venue's decorative hedge, something that wasn't part of my fencing at all, gave way under the combined curiosity of 40 hungry animals. Suddenly there they were, charging into what they must have believed was the greatest buffet ever assembled. Guests screamed. Servers dropped silver trays. One pig discovered the dessert table before anyone could react. Another pushed straight through a decorative flower display. Daisy, who had always believed every cake belonged to her personally, planted all 4 feet against the wedding table and helped herself to several spectacular mouthfuls of buttercream before the entire masterpiece leaned sideways and collapsed onto the grass. Children shrieked with laughter while adults climbed onto chairs trying to stay clean. Someone's expensive ice sculpture shattered after 2 pigs bumped the display table. One boar proudly trotted across the lawn wearing what looked suspiciously like the groom's tuxedo jacket hanging from his mouth. I was still standing near my pasture when my phone started ringing. Travis. I answered on the 3rd ring. He was practically screaming. Walter, get your animals out of here right now. I listened to the chaos in the background for a second before asking as calmly as I could. Animals? You mean my pigs? They're destroying everything. I looked toward the breeze rustling through my orchard. Well, I said, they must have caught the scent of those apples somebody's been taking. There was complete silence for about 2 seconds before he exploded again, but by then I'd already hung up. It took nearly an hour for animal control, venue staff, and half the local sheriff's department to round up every pig. Thankfully, no one was seriously hurt, although plenty of designer shoes, dresses, and expensive decorations certainly couldn't say the same. The real trouble didn't begin until several days later when the insurance investigators arrived. During their review, they started asking routine questions about food suppliers, purchase records, produce invoices, vendor documentation. Briar Ridge couldn't produce legitimate paperwork for a large portion of the apples served that evening because there wasn't any. My security footage, the sheriff's reports, and the earlier complaints suddenly became far more important than anyone at the venue had expected. The insurance company refused to cover a significant portion of the losses after concluding that stolen agricultural products had been used as part of the catered event. Several guests who had been knocked over during the confusion filed civil claims against the venue. The ownership board, already frustrated by months of complaints surrounding Travis's management style, acted quickly. By the end of that week, he was gone. About 2 weeks later, I received a phone call from the estate's managing partners asking if I'd be willing to meet. This conversation sounded very different from the last one. There were no polished speeches about exposure, no lectures about marketing, just a straightforward apology. They offered compensation for the documented thefts, reimbursement for damaged trees, funding for upgraded fencing and security cameras, and a long-term purchasing agreement that paid premium wholesale prices for every bushel they ordered. Everything would be in writing. Everything would be paid for before delivery. I accepted because that's what adults do when someone finally chooses accountability over arrogance. Revenge might feel satisfying for a moment, but respect lasts a lot longer. As for my orchard, it recovered. Trees have a remarkable way of rewarding patience. Every fall since then, families have returned to pick apples, children still run laughing between the rows, and my pigs continue living exactly as pigs should: fat, happy, and completely unaware that they're considered local celebrities. Every once in a while, when a wedding photographer sets up near the property line, I notice people glancing toward my pasture with nervous little smiles. They always make sure the gates are securely closed before the reception starts. I suppose that's become part of Briar Ridge's event checklist now. Looking back, I don't think the real lesson had anything to do with pigs. It was about respect. Farmers aren't asking for special treatment. We just expect the same thing everyone else does, that the work of our hands belongs to us until we choose to share it. The moment someone decides they can take that because they have more money, more influence, or a nicer suit, they're already planting the seeds of their own downfall. If you made it all the way to the end, let me know what you honestly think. Did Travis get exactly what he deserved, or did I take things a step too far? I'd really like to hear where you draw the line between justice and revenge. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes hard work should always be respected. I'll see you in the next story.